All right, so I kind of want to do a day in the life of a web developer video, and I just want to kind of give you an actual real life perspective of like what does a web developer do all day, 5 days a week for 8 hours a day. You see these videos of people like getting out of bed and doing their day in the life and pouring coffee and putting their shoes on, and like they literally tell you absolutely nothing about what it's like to be a web developer. So now I say I work remote, so my perspective is probably going to be a little bit different from other people's perspective, although I think a lot of people work remote these days. I've been working remote for like almost like 9 years now. So I just get up. Some days I have like 10 minutes to spare and I get on my computer and I start working, right? Other days I get ready, drink some water, make a coffee, whatever, and then I get on my computer. But the gist of like, what does a web developer do every day? I think the first thing I need to kind of explain is the Scrum methodology. So a lot of different software projects will do different things. And there's Agile, there's Waterfall, there's Scrum, there's Kanban. There's a lot of different like processes you can follow as a team to try to deliver software. Our team happens to follow like kind of like a Scrum type of methodology where if you don't know what this is, basically every week or two you plan out a sprint. And in the sprint, you pull out some stories that you think you're going to work on or hopefully that you can finish within those 2 weeks. And then as you finish them, you get them reviewed, you get them deployed, and then you can mark that thing as done. Now we're doing kind of like a Kanban mix with the Scrum. I would say we're kind of more doing Kanban. So let me take a step back because I think I just jumped ahead. So now that you kind of understand what Scrum is, every day when we get to work, typically you check emails, like I'll have like a bunch of spam emails and stuff. It takes me like 5 minutes to get through them. But then I also go and check our Slack channel, right? So at work, we all discuss and, collaborate on Slack, which is very similar to Discord. So honestly, I could just show Discord. In Slack, we have channels on the left. Some of it is related to tech discussion. Some of it is related to project discussion. And all of our members are in the Discord channel that we can kind of message with a PM, a private message or a direct message, whatever you want to call it. And then we also have our clients, right? So we work on a project where we have clients that we have to talk to, and they are also part of our Slack channel. So if you ever have a question for the product owner who happens to be on the client side of our team, then we can just go ahead and ask them a question about like, hey, is this drop down kind of containing the correct information that you expected the drop down to have? Is this button doing what you'd expected to have? And then we also have our UX and designers in the Slack as well that we collaborate with every day. So basically, again, the day in the life is you look at your emails, you check to see if there's any Slack messages, but then you typically start the day with something called a stand-up. So I kind of like filled out a mock calendar. Like this is just all bogus stuff here. But on this mock calendar, typically every morning around the same time, you have something called a stand-up. This is a Scrum, I guess you could say a ceremony or a Scrum meeting that happens where basically for 15 minutes, in our cases, ours run a little bit longer, like 30 minutes. You tell everyone what you're doing, what you're working on, and kind of explain to your team if there's anything that's blocking you or if you have any issues and you need help. Now, I honestly don't really know what the purpose of this is, especially since we have Slack and we can communicate via instant message. I feel like this is more of an archaic thing that we did in the past when people didn't really collaborate that well and they didn't know how to talk to each other. But we still do it anyway. You get together every morning, you talk about what you're doing, you talk about what the goals are for the quote unquote sprint. How are you going to achieve those goals? And then in our, and like I said, every project's different. So in our stand up, we actually demo daily work to our product owner, right? So our product owner is our client. And when we work on a feature, whether it's like a third of the way done or half of the way done, we will show that work to the client and the UX members and all the other developers so that we're all on the same page of what this feature does, where's the status of the feature, and are we on the right path, right? So typically in Scrum, like you do like a main review at the end of your sprint, which is where you share all these features and, the stakeholders can go and see what you've implemented and what you finished. But along the way, like we want to get that daily rapid feedback from our product owner who really understands how the product should work and understands all the users who are using the product. So we kind of do like daily demos if possible about any new features in our stand-up. And then once stand-up is done, we typically go about our daily work, right? So I'm going to talk about these other things in a bit. But for our daily work, basically, we use something called ZenHub. So I have an extension set up in Chrome called ZenHub. And when you go to GitHub, you get this tab that you have access to. When you click it, you get this cool little like flowchart workflow of all your stories, I guess you could say. So the way that Scrum kind of works is you break up your work that needs to be done into something called user stories. And every user story usually just explains like what we need to do, like what does the user need, and it tries to give high-level bullet point overviews of like what we need to add, right? So for all these user stories, they have different states, right? So typically you have all these new issues on the left where you just create new issues. No one's worked on them yet. No one's even really thought about them. It's like it's kind of a placeholder staging area for issues. But at some point, the product owner takes these issues and tries to figure out which ones are the most important, and he pulls them into the product backlog and typically prioritizes them, with the most important or relevant being at the top, and then going down in order is the least important, right? It's kind of setting the stage of like, what are we going to work on when we start finishing and popping stuff off the top of this stack? And he'll come through, he'll make sure it's all like cleaned up a little bit and everything seems fine. But once he's done his work on like writing these stories, which I'm not going to click on one yet, but once he's like written out like what the story needs to do, we will do something as a team called backlog refinement. Okay, so here I have a meeting that's like an hour or two backlog refinement, where as a team, we all get together and we kind of read through these stories and we make sure that nothing is like out of the ordinary. Nothing is too crazy that can't be implemented. Sometimes you write a user story and all the developers are looking at it and be like, no, this is not going to work. Like this is just technologically not possible. Or sometimes a user story will be like, rated like a, I don't know, a 1 or something, and it's actually like really hard. And then also typically in backlog refinement, I think our team does something called estimations, where you basically read through the story, and as a developer, you kind of just get a rough feeling of like, is this easy or is this hard? And you just throw a number at it, right? So typically we use like the Fibonacci sequence 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. And if this is a really hard story, like you know it's going to take like a week or 2 or 3, you add a 13 on it. If you think it's going to take 2 days, you add a 1 on it. Now, technically, you're not supposed to map estimates to, you know, time that it takes, but that's usually what it always boils down to, let's be honest. But just kind of don't spend too much time with estimates. Just throw a number out there that you think meets what the story would be. Okay, so that's backlog refinement. You don't have to do the story pointing in the backlog refinement, but I think you just have to do it before it gets into your sprint. And again, we don't really do sprints in our project, so I'm just kind of talking about something that we don't even do. But I wanted to make sure that you guys are familiar with it. Okay, so that's backlog refinement. Now, sprint planning is basically the team will go and look at the product backlog, and they will pull in enough stories that the team feels comfortable with that they could finish all in a sprint. And again, a sprint is either a week or 2, it depends on the team. And if you can finish, let's say, these 2 stories in a sprint, then that's all you put in your sprint backlog. So once you plan out the sprint, like you figure out what stories are you actually going to work on as a team, the sprint starts. And then you and your other developers and your UX will start working on stories either together, individually. I don't know, it's up to you. And our team, we like to do a lot of pair and mob programming. So after we've done these meetings and whatnot, and we're kind of done with stand-up, we will join a Zoom. We use Zoom at work, where basically you can do like, voice-to-voice, webcam-to-webcam chat. And we have breakout rooms where you can join different breakout rooms, and every breakout room has a different subset of developers and UX people working together on one of these stories. Okay, so that kind of, the day in the life is like, that's kind of it right there. After stand-up and after all these other meetings, which I'll explain these 2 in a bit, we basically just work on coding and implementing. Okay, so like in this case, let's say that we started the sprint, I went ahead and grabbed this story and I wanted to work on it, right? So I'd go ahead and click on this, I would assign it to myself, I'd read through it, and I try to understand it. So this is kind of how our stories are mapped out. I kind of dumbed this down, but you usually start off with like a sentence or a description that kind of explains what this story is for, like who it's for, why is this important, like why would I need a teacher to be able to find graded out submissions or non-graded submissions. And then usually you have a bullet point list of acceptance criteria. These are things that us developers work towards meeting. And once you feel like you can check this little acceptance criteria off, the story is done, right? So you get it, you merge it into your main branch, you ship it, whatever, and the PO and your QA team can review it along the way. Now, something that we do on our project is we have something called the definition of done. So before you can actually mark this story as done, these are some things that have to be finished on the story, right? So the code is covered with unit tests, feature is covered with integration tests, code meets quality standards defined by team. Now, typically most of these are going to be set up in CI/CD, and they're all automated. But we do have a checkbox here just to like manually remind people that, hey, you need to write unit tests for your stuff. You need to integration test your stuff. We have a check for making sure that all new interfaces are tested with Pally or Axe for accessibility. The app, it has acceptable Lighthouse scores. You want to make sure your app runs fast. So you have all these additional things that we do, which a developer might feel like, they might forget sometimes. So we have this definition of done, and no story can be called done until we've done all these things, right? So that kind of helps not shove work out too fast and make sure that the quality control on our stories are high. We believe a lot in unit testing, integration testing, and all types of testing. So we want to make sure that the stuff we write is actually solid. But once you worked on the story, okay, so what we typically do is you will go to VS Code and you will check out some type of branch for your feature, and then you will start working on implementing the feature, right? So nothing too, out of the ordinary here. It's just coding, right? You have to basically go back and keep reading through this story that you're trying to work on, and you just implement whatever views you need. You implement whatever features you need to make those acceptance criteria pass. Write whatever tests you need, write integration tests, and then when you're done, what we do is we make something called a pull request. And by the way, like I said, as we do a lot of pair and mob programming, so we are going to be in a Zoom with a bunch of other developers, usually 2 or 3 total, and we are all working on the same branch. So we'll do rotations, so someone will drive for 10 minutes, and then we'll push the code, and someone else will take over, and we'll just swap people's machines. And since we're using Zoom, we can all look at the same like screen share, basically. And that's how we kind of operate. So we'll be in a Zoom for like couple hours a day, sometimes all day, sometimes less, depending if you want to go heads down and you just want to listen to music and code. It's really up to you. We're not really strict about a lot of this stuff, but the more that you pair and the more that you knowledge share, I think the better the team composition will be and the better the project will be. So that's kind of what we do. And then once you're done with the feature, you think you're done, you need to get it deployed somewhere so that the product owner and whatever QA team you might have can go in, tear your story apart and find all the bugs that you did not cover with unit tests and integration tests. Additionally, I'll say we have, once the story is brought into the sprint backlog, that's when you're technically supposed to have your UX and designer start looking at it and adding designs for the story, right? The story is supposed to be super, super dumb and generic, and it's not supposed to tell you how to implement it. If you have acceptance criteria that says a user can click on a button, a user can navigate to a page, then your acceptance criteria are not written properly, because now you're prescribing someone else who's not an expert in UX and design and engineering is prescribing how the story needs to work, how the feature needs to work. And this is why we have a UX team. Their job is to figure out and talk to the actual users what would work best for the users. So we try to keep these as dumb as possible, so that the development team can actually start talking to users and designing and building the correct solution for the user specifically. Now, it really depends on the team. If you're a product owner and you know exactly what your users will need, then yeah, I guess it's fine that you could start adding a couple of sentences that kind of prescribe how the solution is. But the idea is, if you prescribe too many solutions here, you're going to kind of tarnish the creative mindsets of your dev team, and they're not going to be able to implement the best solution, basically. If someone tells you that they need a page, you get tunnel vision, and all you do is you start working on a page when maybe what they needed is a modal. Maybe they needed a tab, another tab with a tab panel. Maybe they needed some type of side panel. You don't know, the product owner doesn't know, and it's up to the dev team to figure that out. Anyway, I went on a tangent there. But once you're done with the story, we make something called a pull request to your develop branch or your main or your master branch, whatever you want to call it. And the moment you make the pull request, this is going to run a bunch of automated checks. Okay, so in our case, I just set up one just to kind of show you. But in our project, we use Circle CI and GitHub Actions, where basically we run a bunch of tests over your code base. We run linters over your changes. And you can go into the GitHub Actions. You can look to see like, okay, can this actually run npm build successfully? Sometimes your npm build will fail, and you don't know that until you actually like make a PR because you forgot to run it locally. Sometimes your test will fail because you forgot to run the entire test suite locally. So we have all of these checks run in Circle CI and in GitHub Actions so that we make sure that the code is a high quality. Now, once all your checks pass, like we'll have like 10 or 15 of these, and you'll see a bunch of green arrows and everything will be green. Once everything's good, we then wait for other people who haven't worked on the story to come along and hopefully review it. Okay, so they'll come through and they'll read through all your file changes and try to understand like, okay, what did they change? Did they change something the proper way? Are they doing things to our code standards, etc.? So kind of flipping that, if it was me doing the review, I'm trying to read through the code and try to just point out any high level design issues. I don't like to point out any type of nitty gritty, like nitpicky stuff about like, oh, you should have used a for each instead of a for loop here. Like, I don't care. I really don't care, as long as everything is tested, everything is like proper in terms of our clean architecture we try to follow. And there's nothing like blatantly wrong with the design that is going to bite us in the butt when we deploy as the prod. Those are the things I'm looking for. Anything that's lower level and like nitpicky, I'm hoping our linters will find, and also whatever type of security checks we have and code quality runners that we have set up will find as well. There's a lot of things out there, a lot of tools out there that you can run in your CI/CD pipeline that check your code for quality, like such as like cyclomatic complexity, if you're doing things improperly in your JavaScript, or if you have wrong syntax in your YAML files, etc. So I don't really care to review for that stuff. I just want the higher level, like, is this a good solution? And hopefully along the way, like, people are communicating in Slack and talking about what they're implementing, so that it's not like, 2 weeks out we get this PR that has tons of changes. Although we have been doing that a lot in our project, where we have big PRs with tons of changes, just the way that our project kind of operates, unfortunately. But the idea is you're supposed to make a bunch of these PRs for your story over and over and over again. You have a bunch of small PRs, people review them, you get them merged in, and you do continuous integration. In our project, we don't do that, unfortunately. We don't really do continuous integration like we used to, due to the nature of our project. But once everything's good and people have reviewed, and you have some reviewers check off on your story, you basically merge that in, and that's going to kick off another pipeline sequence, where basically we take the code that was just changed and we automatically deploy that to an environment. In our code base, we have a dev, a staging, a test. We have like another environment for our client, and then we have production. So there's a bunch of different environments that we can deploy to. And once the code is deployed to that environment, we basically move the story to review QA. So we'll kind of just move it over. And then at that point, we know that the product owner should be looking at that. The QA team should be looking at it. They'll go through and they'll find any issues and bugs, and they'll move that back to in progress if they find something wrong with it. And then that process just keeps going back and forth. The idea is to like hopefully not have to do that too much, because if the story is written good enough, there's not a bunch of thrashing back and forth, because the developers can read through the story and implement exactly what the product owner wants, or exactly what the users will need. If the story is not written well, then that's when you might get a bunch of back and forth. Or if the devs just miss stuff. Sometimes we just miss stuff. We're human, right? We don't always code perfectly every time, but sometimes we'll miss something or implement something incorrectly, or a bug was introduced, which is found, and we'll just move that back to in progress and keep working on it. And we keep doing that process until it's fully finished. Everything's done. The definition of done is done. And at that point, when it's all done, we will then promote that to a higher environment. So for an example, when we did the merge, we're not going to be merging to main. We'll probably merge to like a test environment, or a staging environment, or a dev environment. And once it's checked off and everything's good, we'll take the dev environment and we'll promote it to the next higher environment, such as staging or test. And then when test is all good, we'll promote that to another further environment, such as prod, which is where the users will be able to use our feature and start interacting with it. Now, we do a lot of other stuff as well. Like sometimes we'll do feature flags where we don't want the user to be able to access the feature just yet, but we do want to get it deployed to prod just to make sure that we got it all set up, ready to go. And then we can just basically go into a database and turn a Boolean from false to true, and then all the users has access to that new feature. Again, everything we do on our project is all automated with Terraform and infrastructure as code. We deploy everything to Amazon, and we use a bunch of different services there. We use like Lambda, API Gateway, CloudFront, we used to use CloudFormation. We don't use that anymore. We use OpenSearch, we use DynamoDB. Like, we use a lot of stuff in Amazon to kind of set up the entire system. So a deploy can take a little bit of time. I think it takes about like 10 minutes to fully deploy the entire application to Amazon, just because of how many like moving parts there are. And then of course there's the quality control checks beforehand, and then after we do some smoke tests. So overall it takes like 30-40 minutes to do a full deploy, or from start to finish. But that's kind of the flow. So we kind of just do that every day. for the week until we've finished all of the stories that are in our sprint. Now, sometimes if someone's sitting around twiddling their thumbs, you can start pulling in some more work, which is why we kind of like the whole idea of Scrum just doesn't make sense to me, because you're always going to have people sitting there waiting for more work unless you can just grab work off the backlog, right? And if you want to increase your throughput, then yeah, you want developers just keep on grabbing off the product backlog and working on stuff. But let's say you finish all the stories within the first week of a 2-week sprint. Like, what do you guys do? Well, you just keep bringing in more stories. So I think Kanban makes more sense logically in my head. The whole idea of Scrum is basically, I think, to do like metrics and analytics and tracking against your team and your performance. That's just what I think it is. I know other people will say, oh, no, it's not for that. It's, you know, to make a quality product and stuff. No, I think it's more of like tracking your team and really making sure that you're trying the best you can to figure out and solve all these stories. But half the time you don't even finish them within the sprint. So it's just a big waste of time to like do all this sprint planning for stuff that you know you're not going to finish. And stuff always comes up when you're working on stories where you can't actually fully finish it. You don't successfully complete all the stories in the sprint. So like, what's the point? You keep doing that over and over again. And then what you end up doing is you just start grabbing less stuff to start your sprint with, because you want to make sure you finish all the stories in your sprint. And now you just start off with a bunch of less work and you're really just, your throughput is just going down. But again, that was another tangent. So day in the life. I talked about stand-up, what we do every day. We meet, we do sprint planning to figure out what needs to go into the sprint if you're doing proper Scrum. We do backlog refinement to go through stories and make sure that all the developers can vote on them and give them estimates and make sure that the story seems like it's written properly and no one has any questions about anything. But once you finish your sprint and you've fully deployed all your stuff to production, then you have something called a sprint demo/review, where basically you get into a meeting, you demo off all the work that you've done to some stakeholders. You know, typically you're working with a product owner, but depending on the size of your company, you might have a bunch of other investors or stakeholders who want to see the progress of your project, and they will come every week or 2 weeks and they want to see those features. So we'll demo those features to them, they'll give us feedback, and then we'll take that feedback and again, just inject that back into our cycle of making new stories, refining stuff, making sure we organize what it needs to be the highest priority. Because depending on how you do the demo and depending on the feedback you get, the priority of your items might change. You might introduce a bunch of new issues. You might need to grab those and put them to the highest of the backlog. Because if your investor is like Elon Musk and he says he wants this, then that's probably going to skew what you're going to work on next. And then after you've done the sprint, after you've done the demo, we do something called a retro, where everyone gets together and talks about their feelings. And they talk about, how did the last sprint go? Are there any things that we could potentially improve on? What were some things that went really well? What were some things that we excelled in? What are some things that we did not excel in? And we kind of just like talk as a team to try to figure out pain points in our process to improve it. From my experience, the retro is usually hit and miss. Usually it's just a bunch of people trying to squeeze out ideas to work on, and kind of just a waste of time in my opinion. But honestly, like the retro, let me take a step back and not sound so negative, but the idea of the retro is to increase, psychological safety, be able to talk to your team, collaborate with your team, be communicative, if that's the word, with your team, and really like try to improve. Okay. It's not for, making people feel bad. It's not for like trying to answer to the man of like, why did you guys not get the sprint done? It's just a way to like do some introspection and be like, okay, these are a couple things we hit along the sprint that really slowed us down. What can we do next sprint to make sure that we don't run into similar pitfalls? That's like the only point of the retro. And also to celebrate the features that you got deployed to production, right? You have to kind of reward yourself for the hard work you did. And that's the idea of the retro. Now, granted, I think, I'm not really a person who likes to talk about their feelings and how stuff went. Like, I just want to do my work. But the retro, I think if your team is good and can collaborate and communicate over Slack daily and do it multiple times a day and like really talk about issues the moment they arise, I don't think the retro is that important, because you're on Slack all day, you're on Zoom all day. You can talk about these issues. You have stand up all day to talk about issues. You have all this time after stand up to make meetings to talk about issues that you can try to resolve problems and whatnot. Yeah, so that's kind of like the day in the life. I know most of it's coding. If you see all this white space from 9 to 5, white space is coding time, where you're basically in a Zoom chatting with your other developers, trying to problem solve, trying to fix bugs, trying to get those things deployed out. And your deployment cycles will change depending on the project and how large scale project you are. If you're on a startup, you might be deploying to prod multiple times a day. If you're not on a startup, you're on like an enterprise, you might be deploying the prod every 2 weeks or something. But that is the gist of what I do every day. I sit down, I do these same meetings every week. Doesn't change. It's the same stuff. Sometimes we'll change the start times or end times of some of these meetings if we need more or less time. But for the most part, we do the same stuff. We get into work. We look at the story that we're working on. We continue on it from yesterday. We just keep on trying to fix it. We get it deployed, and then we do the same thing. So that is a day in the life of a web developer. And again, I'm just one perspective, and every team does stuff very, very differently. But I just wanted to kind of share that insight with you all in case you haven't ever worked in a professional web development environment and you're not really sure what to expect. So this is what you can expect if you're working on some type of Scrum methodology. But again, this is just one perspective. Leave a comment below if your company or your team does something similar with the Scrum and the retro and all that. And if you use any of the same tooling that I mentioned, such as ZenHub, or if you do Kanban, I'm kind of interested in hearing how you guys do things, and maybe it'll like enlighten me to other approaches. I really like GitHub Actions. It's really cool. So make sure you check out that if you wanted to actually like set up quality control in your code. That's about it. Yeah. If you enjoyed watching this video, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, comment, bell, who cares? And then also, if you want to join my Discord and ask me a question directly or talk about this further, feel free to. I have a Discord. It's in the description of the video. And you can also join if you're just stuck in React or stuck in learning how to code in JavaScript or whatever. You want to kind of get some help along the way. We got a lot of people in the Discord who are willing to help you out if you have any questions that you're stuck on. Have a good day and happy coding.